Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman. Hey, Joe.
Hi, Pam.
So one of the things that I remember best from when I was first starting out in law teaching were two things. One of them was always have a box of Kleenex on your desk where the students can get to it without you having to get up, because it's hard on them if they start to cry and you have to run to the bathroom. The other thing I remember is a study that was done by my then colleague John Monahan, who's a psychologist, that showed that in almost every profession, people who have what's called an optimistic explanatory style about the world do better. But the one place where that's not true is law school. That people who are pessimists do better in law school. And so when we think about lawyers and the legal world, we're usually talking about the law and what lawyers do there. But today we're going to have a different kind of show. We're going to be focusing on the internal life of lawyers and law students, maybe because we're also honoring Mental Health Week this week.
That's right. Being a law student is tough, and unfortunately, being a lawyer can be tough as well. Turns out a pessimistic outlook is also associated with being a little bit pessimistic. And so today, to help us along our path, we have a recent Stanford Law School grad and a sociologist, Kathryne Young, who's written a terrific book entitled How to Be Happy, Sort of, in Law School.
And we actually have a second guest today, Joe, and that guest is you, because as most of our regular listeners know, you are, in addition to being a law professor, a practicing clinical psychologist and somebody who focuses on mental health issues.
That's right. I've looked forward to this broadcast. And Katie, I've looked forward to having you on. You know, I started your book, Katie, and I was a little skeptical because the book covers everything. It covers how to take an exam, how to get your first job, how to manage relationships, how to maintain your emotional equilibrium. I thought, how can one person cover all that and not just be locked into her own particularistic worldview? And I started reading it, and I started nodding to myself, well, she's got that right. That's a nice point. Yeah. By the time I was about halfway through, I was a real convert. So congratulations on the book, which is going to help you be happy, sort of.
Sort of. But one of the things that struck me, and I've known you since you were a first-year law student, was you were an abnormally happy law student. So what got you to decide to write a book about the general run-of-the-mill law student who's not nearly as happy as you were?
Yeah, you know, I found that I really enjoyed the substance of law school, but I found that the kind of trappings of law school were a little bit more difficult for me. And during my first year of law school and subsequently, I became a sociologist. I enrolled in a JD PhD program, and I began seeing law school through a more sociological lens. So I would do these things that seem nuts probably, but like I would map where people sat based on race and gender. I would map who was called on. I just became so interested in the sociology of law school and law school as a phenomenon. And that led me to just talk to alums, to current law students about their experiences. I did all this just kind of out of idle sociological interest. And it eventually developed into this book in which I surveyed 1,100 law students from over 100 different law schools, and I was really struck by some of the patterns that law students fell into over their 3 years.
So, what was the most surprising thing you found from?
Well, you know, so Tolstoy famously wrote that all happy families look alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way, and I was surprised that with law students it seemed to be the exact opposite. That is, all unhappy law students kind of were unhappy for really very similar reasons that had to deal with anxiety, imposter syndrome, and other things I talk about in the book. But all the happy law students looked very different from one another. There were so many strikingly different paths to law school happiness. Another thing that surprised me about the book was the extent to which certain backgrounds affected people's law school experience. And this was across different kinds of law schools and different law school tiers. So we might expect, and we know from existing research, that race and gender powerfully shape people's experiences in law school. But social class, for example, and political affiliation, there were just kind of surprising identity characteristics and affiliations that really affected how people navigated through law school and how happy they were able to be.
Well, thank you, Katie. And as I hear you describe this, I think of a piece of yours I read last night that we talked about, which is a study of the sport of Hawaiian cockfighting. So you're someone that has looked at a lot of things and are able to put yourself in the position of various participants. You've been a law student. You've talked to law students. What are 2 or 3 of the biggest mistakes they make? If you could give a few pieces of advice, don't do X, what would they be?
Well, I would say that law students, on average, were a lot happier than the chickens in the cockfight. So that's something to note for perspective. For law students, a few take-home pieces of advice. One pattern that I saw over and over in students' experiences, and alums express this too, was that they felt that there was kind of an ideal way to be a law student, one that involved law review, one that involved clerkships, that involved, a certain set of grades, a certain set of classes, and that everything else kind of fell short. I mean, that was kind of the Platonic conception, and then there was whatever else you do. And I think that falling into that way of thinking can be really harmful. I mean, in law school, your goal isn't to approximate the ideal law student. Your goal is to find your path through law school. So I think that's one thing that I would hope students take away from the book. And it's something that certainly applies to lawyers as well. Another important theme is to kind of be open to change and be open to the things that spark your interest. And again, this also applies to practicing lawyers. After the JD study, which was done about, it's done in waves. So after people graduate from law school, a few years out, a few more years out, to see, where people are at. And it's amazing how many people change not only jobs, but entire substantive areas of law. So I think we have this idea that, you go into law, you become, an X kind of lawyer, and you're kind of stuck. That's kind of what you do. And that's just simply not the case. And I think with law students, too, the happiest ones were law students who said things like, I came in just knowing I wanted to do corporate law, but then I took this cool water law class, and I ended up doing that instead. So just really keeping their eyes open.
So one question I have is, are law students in this sense different than other professional students? Because I know you've been looking at and teaching a course for sociology grad students about how to be a sociology grad student. Is there something distinctive about the law here? Or is this basically advice for anybody going into any sort of profession or career?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's generally it applies to people across the board, but we know that law students are different from other grad students as a group. I mean, for one, we know that law students have higher rates of things like anxiety and depression. If you compare entering law students to undergraduates in terms of their levels of happiness, of subjective well-being, they start out about the same as the average undergrad. That tanks through the first year, and it actually doesn't get better on average the second or third year. It kind of continues to dip. What we see in other professional schools or in PhD programs is that the level of happiness sort of goes up or it kind of levels off. And this may relate to what you were talking about, Pam, about pessimism and law students. But on average, law students are a slightly different breed. They're very risk averse. They're very anxious. They're very type A. And that definitely distinguishes them.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with sociologist Kathryne Young about her book, How to Be Happy, Sort of, in Law School. Joe?
Katie, I wanted to amplify something you said, that it seems not to be the people that come in law school so much. They look kind of average in terms of happiness. Something happens in law school, and there's all sorts of theories about what might happen. And then it seems to keep happening, unfortunately, as you mentioned, after law school. I also want to pick up on one of your comments about don't try to be the platonic law student. One of the interesting things about law school that you point out, and for our listeners who haven't been law students, this will seem surprising that once you get to law school, you find the platonic ideal involves things you never dreamed of. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of, you get to law school and you find out, here's what should be really important to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is particularly true for people who come from backgrounds where they don't have lawyers in their family. And interestingly to me, at the top 10 law schools, about half of law students actually do have lawyers in their family. So there are people coming in with a lot of background knowledge. But particularly for those who don't, they come in, often really not knowing what they're getting into, with this sort of vague sense of, my philosophy degree sort of seems not to have gotten me a job. I'm a good writer, and I didn't take a lot of STEM classes. Law school seems great. And so as soon as they enter law school, they get on the ground and they realize that there's kind of this hierarchy of things, of prestige that they are told implicitly or explicitly they should be aspiring to. And as I mentioned, some of them may not know what law review is before they come in, but boy, a month in, they sure know that that's what they're supposed to be wanting to do, that's what the, quote unquote, good students do.
And law review, I bet Pam was about to jump in on this too. For those of you who don't know, law review is a student-run journal that publishes academic articles.
Well, the thing that I think is most surprising actually is clerking, because when there are all of these stories of people who come out of law school and they do what's called a judicial clerkship. You're an assistant to a judge for a year, and it's a highly prestigious job. But when you tell people who aren't lawyers that you spent 3 years in law school and now you're going to be a clerk, a lot of them say, well, I'm sure someday you'll be able to get an actual job in the field. And so there is this notion of these things that I think nobody was thinking about doing before they got to law school, and now they feel it's essential for them to do it. And of course, one of the things is to get into law schools is not super easy, even today with the decline in applications. And so these are all people who've always been successful their whole life. And now they look around the classroom and they don't see those people that they're clearly going to do better than. And I think that's a really stressful thing for a lot of them.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, and they've been told at every stage of their education, high school is going to be so much harder than middle school. Oh, college is going to be so much harder than high school was. And, that always, for many law students, that turned out not to be true. They could kind of write circles around people, whatever. But then they show up in law school and, in fact, it actually is true. So that can induce a kind of panic and anxiety. And when you're panicked and anxious and you're not so sure about your career, it's very tempting to grasp on to these kind of what appear to be the traditional markers of success. You've derived a lot of self-worth from those kinds of markers of success in the past. So, of course, it seems like that's what you should do as a law student.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Kathryne Young, a sociologist, about her book, How to Be Happy, sort of, in law school. Joe?
Katie, one of the things you mentioned is a lot of people come to law school with no lawyers in their family. I had lawyers not in my immediate family, but somewhere in my family. I still never heard of clerking. And I didn't really know what lawyers did for a living, actually, because having an uncle that has a job as a lawyer doesn't really tell you what he does on a day-to-day. Would you recommend that students before law school try to hang out with a lawyer and see what that person actually does?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that you're right. A lot of students come in exactly the same position you were talking about. They know someone who's a lawyer, or they have a family member who's a lawyer, and it seems sort of admirable. But also, I've noticed that students tend to construct their idea of what a lawyer is or does from those very limited experiences. So I would suggest not only that students talk to or shadow, one practicing lawyer before law school, but maybe a few different types of practicing lawyers before law school.
I think it's a great idea, and I think it would help with something else. When you get in law school, there's kind of a law school bubble, and you think what's important is a clerkship. But if you actually shadowed practicing lawyers and asked them, talk to me about how important clerkships are, they'd look at you like you were crazy, because at that point in their life, they're usually not very important. So it can give you some perspective.
I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think most happy lawyers will tell you whatever they did in their biography was critical to their happiness.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so a lawyer who did clerk will say it was the most formative experience of my life. A lawyer who didn't clerk and is happy will say, clerking, who needs it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it actually reminds me of research that I'm doing right now on parole commissioners in California. And one of the things I ask them is, what are the characteristics of a good parole commissioner? Unsurprisingly, whatever their biography looks like is exactly
brown
what you
hair,
should be
brown
doing.
hair, 5'7", orange glasses.
I mean,
that's
right.
what makes you. That's what makes you successful. I wanted to focus, if we could, for just a moment on something that you write about in the book, which is the imposter syndrome, and people sense they don't belong and they're just faking it and they're going to be caught out. I mean, is that distinctive for lawyers, or is that just something that people have generally, and how does that affect them?
I think it's something many people have generally. Certainly, it's something I see among PhD students as well. It's particularly common among high-achieving women, but we know that it's certainly not exclusive to women. Imposter syndrome is, basically it's kind of like having a bully on your shoulder all the time. It's like it's not an actual syndrome, but more a constellation of thought patterns where you have a tendency to over-internalize failure and under-internalize success. And I think it's particularly something that law students experience because of the uncertainty. Because it's not like, as Joe said, many of them didn't really know what it was like to be a lawyer before they entered law school. So in some sense, yeah, they are imposters. They are, kind of trying to figure out how to be a lawyer. But there are some concrete ways that people can work on imposter syndrome and work on overcoming it. One is simply to pretend that, it's a friend who experienced whatever you experienced rather than yourself. We tend to judge ourselves more harshly than others. So, if your friend didn't get a job, would you think, God, my friend actually is kind of an idiot? Probably not, unless you're mean. But many people think that about themselves, right? I mean, another thing you can do is simply acknowledge that you feel like a fraud and then move on. I feel like I have absolutely no business giving X presentation, but you know what? I'm going to do it anyway.
And what would you say to a friend is really a great technique for anybody that feels like an imposter or is down on themselves. And it's a technique psychologists use all the time.
And we're going to turn to some of those techniques and thinking about lawyers when we come back. We'll have more from our guest, Kathryne Young, and our other guest and host, Joe Bankman, next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 120.